Hello, my name is Dr. Liz Burtoncrow, and I'm the Director of Education for the Carrillo Center for Nonviolence. Welcome back to Living One, our monthly webinar series where presenters from around the world share their vision of a future in which humans and other animals live as one community in peace and wellness. Given all that's unfolded in the past years, these conversations are more important than ever, for they are more than mere conversations. They are opportunities for building community, salve for the isolating wounds of our time. Through Living One, together we attempt to answer the question, we know it's wrong, but what does right look like? This month, we welcome Hadassah DeJack-Reynolds, co-founder and executive director of Tikkun Olam Farm Sanctuary, or TOFS for short. Tikkun Olam, which means repair in the world in Hebrew, is a forever home for abused, abandoned, neglected, and unwanted animals in Southern Oregon. She is a vegan and has spent nearly 2 decades as an animal rights activist. She did her graduate work at Wilmington University and Westchester University, obtaining her degree in Holocaust and genocide studies with a focus on the psychology of perpetrators, victims, and bystanders. After nearly a decade of teaching college students in her home state of Delaware, Hadassah moved to Oregon, where she merged her love of animals, teaching, and Judaism to create the only Jewish farm animal sanctuary in the country. Over 130 animals reside at TOFS, where they are living their best lives. Hadassah's insights into human trauma and genocide inform her mission to create a healing community where all beings, human and non-human, are welcome. So thank you so much for joining us, and interviewing you today will be our very own Dr. Gabe Bradshaw.
Hello there. Hi, and welcome. This is particularly pleasurable for me because as we were talking before we came on screen, Hadassah and I live fairly close to each other, or closer than a lot of other participants have been. So we could just yell at each other instead of going through Zoom. But anyways, so this is a real treat. And I just wanted to say that my personal experience with Hadassah and Tikkun Olam has been absolutely fantastic. And it's this incredible supernova, animal supernova, which is now taken home in the Applegate in the Rogue Valley here in Southern Oregon. So it's just too irresistible. Just can we jump in, Hadassah, and can you describe Tikkun Olam and what is a Jewish sanctuary, and who is your co-presenter?
Let me start with that first. Thanks, Gay. Thanks for having us. This is Curly Joe, and she is a differently abled chicken who was rescued from the local farm store. We work with the local farm stores here in Southern Oregon, and we take in any birds that are sick or injured or disabled, and we bring them here and we find them forever homes. And last year we were able to save 70 birds, which was 70 babies, which was amazing. And this little girl has a pretty significant, for want of a better word, she has a limp, and she can't be out with other birds because she's stunted, she's compromised. So she is our house chicken, and she is my buddy, and she loves to be held and cuddled, and she makes me comfortable and I make her comfortable. So I thought we'd share this experience together. And she's much cuter than me, so I figured I'd rather look at her than me anyway. So what makes a Jewish farm sanctuary? I think it's a Jewish farm sanctuary because I say it is, but not because there's no prototype available.
It is Jewish, therefore I am. Okay.
Therefore I am, exactly.
Right.
So as you said, Tikkun Olam means repair the world, and that's kind of the cornerstone of Judaism. It's become, in some ways, kind of a social justice mantra for Jews around the world. And so when we came up with the name, we knew it was going to be tricky because Tikkun Olam is obviously Hebrew. The pronunciation isn't easy, but it meant a lot to me and it resonated with me. I was in an Orthodox Jewish community, and although I'm no longer participating in that level of observance, my Judaism, whether it be culturally, religiously, whatever, it's important to me. It matters to me. And I wanted to create a sanctuary based on Jewish values. And that doesn't mean that it's not inclusive. We are incredibly inclusive, and we want all people to join us and be present with us. But what it does mean is that we practice Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, by doing the work that we're doing. We also incorporate one of the Torah precepts is Za'ar Ba'ali Chayim, which means you are not supposed to do harm to animals. And it's actually a commandment. And we take that seriously. And we want to bring Jewish values into how animals are treated. We work, we have opportunities for people to join us for holidays, such, weekly, we have Shabbat on Friday nights. Once our sanctuary is more established, we're in the process of a move right now. We just bought a larger property and we're building it out. It burned in the fire during the Almeida fire. And so we have the opportunity to build from the ground up, and activities that we've offered in the past at our current location and that we'll offer in the future are opportunities to spend Shabbat and have a vegan Shabbat. And for those who are Jewish and grew up in Jewish homes, meat is kind of the cornerstone for a Shabbat meal. Cholents have, they make, and chicken. These are things that people consume regularly. And we want to have an opportunity for people to join us and eat a good vegan meal and share the experience, Jewish or not, to share the cultural experience. We want to have opportunities. We have, since we've moved, we did do our first compassionate Kaporos ceremony, and I'd love to talk about that in a little while, but what that is and what that means. So we've created that. We're partnering with our local synagogues, particularly my synagogue, Havara Shir Hadash. Rabbi David Zaslow has been an enthusiastic supporter of our sanctuary, and we're looking forward to doing more with them as we grow. So the Za'ar Ba'ali Chayim is a big piece. Let's not do harm to animals. We want to look at what kosher eating looks like. Kosher food is defined by I'm trying to think of the English word, the mashgiachs, the people that certify the food, and the hekshers, the label, there's a label that is put on the food that denotes whether or not it is kosher. I don't think there's anything that is considered, that any animal or animal byproduct could technically be considered kosher at this point. And a vegan diet is truly the only way to live and be in compliance with Torah teachings as far as what you eat. So we would like to shine light on diet and kashrut and what that looks like and why we think veganism is the way to go. And we do really,
what you're really doing is, and you mentioned the kapara, so if you don't mind just maybe bringing that in sooner than later.
Sure.
Because that's a twin movement, if you want to call it, that has been precipitated and galvanized by Karen Davis and a group of rabbis and others. They're back east, but of course you're in that network, and that's kind of how we first connected. Is I took some Kaporo roosters, but what you're doing, and also that is really you're expanding. I mean, it's or I don't know if the word is expanding, but you're revisiting and maybe revitalizing Jewish traditions in terms of today and awareness and things like that. So it's a cross species engagement.
Absolutely. Well, Kaporos, let me give it just a quick overview what that is. One, I love Karen Davis and the work that she's done, and I'm from the East Coast, so I spent time, in the Upper West Side and have seen and have participated in helping to save these birds for quite a while. And that is one of the focuses, our primary focuses that we do at Tikkun Olam Farm Sanctuary, is rescue these birds every year. So what Kaporos is, it's a Jewish atonement ritual, and it's annual. It's a sacrifice that involves killing chickens. And the word Kaporos actually means the word atonement. And if you know it, Yom Kippur is one of our holiest days of the year in Judaism. And it's a time for introspection and self-reflection on the year's past transgressions. And it's also an opportunity to ask for forgiveness. That atonement ritual, Kippuros, is performed by a very, very small group of ultra-Orthodox Jews. And they believe through prayer and slaughter that their sins can be transferred to a chicken. It's not in the Torah and Talmud. There's nothing there that says that we should do this, and it's actually based on pagan rituals, which I won't bore you with the whole history of this. And it's also been denounced by some very famous rabbis that are, that their writings are still influential in the Orthodox community today. but for whatever reason, they're ignored when they speak about the not using kaporos, using chickens. So everybody that practices kaporos, like you go into the Orthodox community during this time after Rosh Hashanah, before Yom Kippur, and chickens come into New York City, 100,000 or more, and the streets have crates stacked with these birds. And it's heartbreaking if you've ever seen it. These birds do not have access to food or water for the entire almost week that they're there. They aren't protected from the elements. So they're exposed to, if it's hot or raining, they're not really. I know it's horrible. Don't listen. So they're, they aren't protected from the elements. Many of them will die before the ritual is even performed. The only way that they get food or water is the animal activists that show up and provide water or watermelon for them, so they have something. Mm-hmm. The birds there's killing centers all over New York City during this time, and these birds are taken by the practitioner, and a prayer is said. The bird is circled around their head, either being held by their wings, which are pulled behind their back, or held by their feet, and they're circled around their head 3, 7, or 9 times, and the prayer is said, and then the animal is murdered. And they claim that these birds are given to the poor for food, which, for me, doesn't make it any better. But sadly, that's a lie, and they're not. They don't have the refrigeration facilities. They don't have the people to process the birds if they were to do that. And frankly, a lot of organizations that would take donations, quote unquote, food donations like that, won't take a bird that has gone through this ritual because they find it so deplorable. So these birds suffer, they're killed, and then they're thrown in the garbage. And it just seems to be, this is an abomination, no matter whether you're Jewish or not. But as a Jewish person, I find this intolerable. And my personal goal in life is to see this ended before, not kaporos ended as a whole. I think we actually should be practicing kaporos, but not a kaporos should be done not with animals. It could be done with other things such as money, or it's actually, you can use a potted plant. That's actually by Jewish law halachically appropriate. So you can actually use a plant if you need to use something that was alive. But we can use money, and you can donate money. One of the things that Tikkun Olam did this year, and it was my very first time practicing kaporos, we offered a compassionate option, and we recorded it, and we did it with our rescued kaporos chickens. We have 40 birds that were saved from the ritual, and we went outside and we talked about the ritual, and we shared the ritual. We did it with community, and it was absolutely beautiful. And I think that's one of the things, we know what's wrong. What are we doing right? We need to reclaim this ritual, because if we don't, it's the people who practice it that get to define how it's done. And I stopped being surprised at how many Jews don't even know what kaporos is. You mentioned it, and they're like, I've never heard of it. I don't know what this is. And if you weren't raised in an ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, or you weren't living in that environment, you just aren't familiar with it. And I think that is part of the problem. It's a beautiful ritual if it isn't done at the expense of another living being, losing their life. So I think that's one of the things that we need to do, is actually practice this ritual. If you're Jewish, it needs to be done. We need to get our synagogues involved. And the only way we're going to see it change is if we're willing to work from the inside out. I can go on and on. So if you want to stop me and you have a question, please do. But I have more to say on this if you're interested in hearing it.
No, continue.
Okay.
I mean, you may have questions afterwards, but go continue now.
That's fine. So, again, if people, when we first started protesting kaporos in New York City, it was, there were Jews and non-Jews that came out to protest this, and there was a lot of yelling and shouting and demonstrations and signs, and a lot of shaming and blaming and finger pointing. And we all know that shame is not a good tool to try and evoke change. And activists in the last few years have shifted from that model, which did not go well, to just showing up and witnessing, bearing witness, and providing supportive care for these birds before they die. And it's a really hard thing to do, to sit back and watch this and just be there and be present. But it's also opened the door for dialogue. There's been more opportunities for dialogue. Practitioners are more willing to give chickens now. If a chicken is injured, like a wing is fractured, the bird isn't considered kosher. They're considered treif. They aren't able to be used for the ritual. And practitioners have been pretty resistant to give activists the birds, and they still can be, but with the shift in the approach to helping these birds, we're able to have a more compassionate dialogue with the practitioners, which has given us opportunities to help more birds. So that's outstanding. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful shift. It's not enough, but it's a start.
So you're really also, you're giving a terrific example of sort of redefining or perhaps expanding the everyday, reaction or image of activism in terms of embodying, just embodying a different opinion from what is considered to be the status quo, and also in terms of a transformative element. Like you're talking about the human-human interaction and the presence. You've talked about, just to sort of segue into some of your more formal academic work, you talked about the word bystander. What's the difference? What is a bystander? What is the difference between witnessing and bearing witness and a bystander?
I would say intention would be the difference, because your intention to witness, as opposed to not getting, you're choosing to not get involved because getting involved could actually cause more harm. And I don't see witnessing as not being involved. I think witnessing is an important piece, but being a bystander and walking by and ignoring and acting like it's not happening, that's the difference. So your intention is different. So that would be, my take on it.
I bring that up because, it sounds subtle, but it's really quite different. And certainly there's a historical precedent for that, in terms of, in your own studies of the Holocaust and genocide and things like that, bearing witness, quote unquote, collaboration and bystanding, those are now being re-examined as very powerful elements that either shifted, the trajectory of how the events rolled out, in a good way and a bad way.
One of the things that I've seen at these events, when people have, you're working with a really insular community and they feel persecuted. So I'd like to talk about the psychology of what it's like to live in an insular community. I was there. I know what it feels like, not with this particular ritual, but in general. And so if you aren't Jewish, or you aren't observantly Jewish, this community doesn't care what you have to say. They don't, what you think and believe has no bearing. These are true believers, and true believers do what they think is right for their community. So when you have protesters that are out there yelling insults, it reinforces their need to remain insular. Sadly, a lot of times this fosters a lot of anti-Semitism. So you see a lot of anti-Semitic comments made about this community participating in this. And again, it is off-putting for obvious reasons why this community would not be interested in hearing what you have to say. And I'd love for, listeners, take a minute and just imagine what it would be like to belong to a group of people who has been historically one of the most persecuted religious minorities ever. And imagine that you're in a group, you're a part of that group of people, and someone's yelling at you and telling you something that you have been doing as long as you can remember is immoral. Throw in a little bit of hate speech, and you have managed to successfully trigger a trauma response in a group that has deep intergenerational trauma. And I'm not saying we should ever excuse the behavior of taking the life of another animal, of another being. But if we can come at it with a place from a position, and it's always the better place to come from, we're going to be far more successful than if we look at this group of people and other them and say they aren't like us. And we see it with not with just non-Jews, but with Jews also. Not Jews will try and distance themselves from this community and say, oh, I'm not like them, and go into the othering. And we have to recognize, that we are one, and we all come from different places and come from a place of compassion, and remember you're dealing with a group that is severely traumatized. And that's the approach I like to take.
Well, if you listen to someone like Gabor Mate, which I agree, everyone is, to a lesser or greater extent, we live in a traumatogenic world. And so a lot of the psychologization, if you want to call it that, is from trauma, whether it's direct, indirect, or passed down in that way. And so essentially what you're describing is just one trauma hitting up against another trauma.
Yeah. And I think that if we can just hold that, when, if you are one of the people that goes out and does this work, just, hold that in the back of your mind. And one of the things when we practiced Kapporas this year, and I encouraged people, we did a presentation with, I forget the name of the organization, right before Kapporas, we did a big presentation on this, and ritual is powerful. And when you're doing ritual, if you can hold in your heart and your mind, hold that community that is engaging in this ritual, hold them in your heart and your mind while you are practicing your compassionate version. That's, a way on the very spirit. I'm sounding very woo, and I'm an East Coaster and I'm not terribly woo, but I really do believe ritual is powerful. And if we can do that and hold that in our hearts and minds while we're doing the ritual ourselves with money or with a plant or, something that isn't suffering, that's how we're going to change the world.
And how did you get, now we go back to your own personal journey. Can you just sort of give us a little few breadcrumbs in terms of your arc of, your experiences which brought you into this work explicitly?
Sure. So when I think about, you told me you were going to ask me this, and I thought
sometimes it's very difficult to say it just kind of happens. But
well, it's weird. I never really thought about how unusual my childhood was until just the other day when we talked, and you said, oh, think about what made you go down this path. And my childhood was unusual. My mom rescued everything. So I come by it honestly. But the thing that changed probably my path, a couple of things. One was she rescued dogs and cats, as do many people. But one day she found an injured pigeon, and he had a fractured wing, and she didn't know what to do for him. And he was a she, but we didn't know that. Her name was Rick. So Rick ended up at Tri-State Bird Rescue and Research. And I don't know if you've ever heard of this organization, but they're one of the largest bird wildlife rehabilitators in the country. But at that time, they had just started. They had just been founded. And she took this bird there, and they fixed him and gave him a friend. And we had 2 pigeons. My mother fell in love with the organization and began volunteering there several days a week, and in the summer every day, which meant that at the ripe old age of 10, I was showing up every day at Tri-State Bird Rescue and Research, and they taught me to feed starlings and robins. And then I progressed to songbirds and eventually to raptors. I held my first eagle when I was 11. I was oil bird trained by the time I was 12, something that would never happen today, with insurance and government agencies regulating the way facilities are run. But it was a rich opportunity, and it developed my lifelong love of animals and particularly of birds. And I stayed with that organization until I moved to Oregon about 8 years ago. I was only available for primarily for oil bird when there were oil bird spills. But it was a great opportunity. Between that and I grew up working on farms, and I love all animals, but farmed animals have a special place in my heart. And it was a working farm. It wasn't a farm sanctuary. So you learn to love these animals, and then these animals, are killed. They were exploited for their eggs. They were exploited for their milk. Babies were born, and, they would disappear because they need the milk from the goats. And, it touched me, and I always wanted to be around animals and farm animals. And that laid the groundwork. I worked in veterinary medicine for a number of years, which has been invaluable running a sanctuary because I have a good, solid baseline, which allows me to be better able to serve the animals that are in my care. But that right there, kind of set the groundwork for creating this environment. And I grew up in a less than ideal family life, and I won't go into details, but animals were my salvation. If it wasn't, the resilient child, when you study resilience, what is it that allows someone to be resilient? And for some of us, it's a trusted friend. Some of us, it's an animal. And for me, it was being able to be around animals. It truly made my childhood bearable. And I want our sanctuary to have the opportunity to, we call ourselves a healing community because we want to also focus on the human animal, not just the non-human animal. And I think that is maybe what makes our organization slightly different than others. We are not a petting zoo. I want to be really clear about that. We don't have people come in and just get to, pet animals if they want to. If the animals want to be interacted with, they're allowed to, people can come and visit and spend time with them. And if the animals don't want to be interacted with, that is their choice. So the animals are always at choice for the level of interaction that they take. But we do, my one partner is a therapist and has done animal assisted therapy. Again, the animal is at choice. If the animal doesn't want to interact, the animal doesn't have to interact with another person. But we believe, I believe strongly that exposing people to farmed animals demystifies the ideas around them. We're familiar with dogs and cats, but cows, goats, chickens, sheep, it's, most people don't have the opportunities to engage with them, and giving them, okay, do you want to get down? I think we're going to get down. Giving them the opportunity to engage with farmed animals is one way that we're going to, be able to help make the shift from this is not food, this is someone.
Well, it's just a very different model, if you want to call it that way, from 4-H as an example, which is a really strong, that and others that are related are projects, which are basically in sort of indoctrinating people for relational trauma.
Absolutely. It's truly child abuse. I believe 4-H and FFA, they teach children to love and care for and learn, they teach them good husbandry, and then they take that animal that they've developed a true bond with and send them to auction, and they die. And it's one of the most heartbreaking things that we're doing to our children. And there's a young activist in California. I guess she wants to come back. Zoe Rosenberg. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she is doing some excellent work calling out 4-H and FFA for the abuse to, the humans and the animals. And she does a lot of placement with those animals. And I admire this young activist very much.
Mm-hmm. So with this, your background, how did you move into Holocaust and genocide studies in your academic work?
Oh, I remember sitting at a Shabbos table and trying to figure, I won't go into the whole story of how I got there, but I was at a Shabbos table and I had read extensively, as many Jews do, about the Holocaust. And we were having a conversation at a table, as you do. And this one person said, "Wow, you know so much about this. You should teach." And I had been teaching psychology for a number of years at that point. So I ended up looking into programs and seeing what graduate work was out there for the Holocaust. And it's one of those subjects that not everybody can do this work. It's really challenging to read the material. The program is rigorous. Emotionally and the physical, anybody who's done graduate work knows, the rigor, the academic rigor, but this program is emotionally draining because, you're reading, so many books, and it's 11 o'clock at night and you're reading on death camps because you have to get through this material, and then you have to go to bed, and that's what you're dreaming about and thinking about. And not everybody is designed to do this work. And I believe I am someone that is, wired to be able to do this work. And if you can, you should. So I do. And it informs my, my work currently. I believe that, when we studied in school about stages of genocide, one of the stages of genocide, Stanton's 8 stages of genocide, number 3 is dehumanization. And we talk about dehumanization a lot. You think about the Eternal Jew. It was a propaganda video, and it referred to Jews as rats. The Hutus and the Tutsis. The Hutus referred to the Tutsis as cockroaches. This isn't information that is probably new, but using the other group being vermin, referring to them as vermin, insects, disease, is common. And it is kind of like, it allows us, dehumanization allows us, it gives us a get out of jail free card. And it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of a mental loophole that you can use to allow you to cause harm to another being. And my thoughts on this is that if we are willing to other someone, let me regroup on that. If we're willing to use animals, insects, quote unquote vermin to define dehumanization, that is hugely problematic, and we need to start to the lesser beings need to be considered. And if we can other a cow or a chicken or a sheep, we can other a human. It's just that extension. So until we stop othering animal beings, we're going to continue to see genocide. And it's that's not it's not a hopeful thought, because I really want to be upbeat and positive and say, what are we doing right? But until we stop othering these non-human animals, we're going to see genocide continue, because dehumanization almost always goes into referring to the other as an animal, and somehow harming an animal is okay in our society, in our world.
We still have very deeply in this dominant culture that has evolved, one of the menu items of solving problems is killing and genocide. And you see that we're seeing that right now again with the wolves in North America.
Yeah.
So, something that is, it's not used, the term is not used of genocide, but essentially that's what the behavior of the agencies is, an attitude toward wildlife, in particular those that, any wildlife, to tell you the truth. So it's already there, that nature is already othered in that sense.
Absolutely. It's one of the things that is controversial in the animal rights world is making comparisons to the Holocaust or to genocides and animal agriculture. And I know that Karen Davis wrote a book about this, The Holocaust and the Handmaid's Tale. And then there's another book called Eternal Tripping. Mm-hmm. And these are both excellent books that refer to, what we are doing to animals and how we can look at the Holocaust and genocide model, and it's just being superimposed into big ag, and not necessarily big ag. Any animal, any farmed animal is, subjected to the whim of the person who is responsible for them. And as controversial as it is an excellent comparison. And I also caution people who choose to use it, because it often can be off-putting rather than beneficial. And I would encourage people, when we do talk about it, I'm mindful to use my language carefully, because again, we are dealing with a group of people that have experienced serious trauma and intergenerational trauma, and we don't want to lose our audience by making those comparisons, but they are truly valid comparisons in my humble opinion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you see, as you bring your experience from those studies, do you see the trauma transmission among the chickens that, for example, that you work with and live with you?
Sometimes some birds are surprisingly resilient. animals are surprisingly resilient, more so than we are. And that's evolutionarily advantageous for them to be so. But I have had a few birds that have come through, and not as much from Caporos, not those birds are so young when they come. I mean, they are 5 weeks old when they show up at these killing centers. They're babies, and they seem to rebound so well with love and care and compassion at home. But I have had particularly chickens come in that have experienced flocks being killed by predators. I'm thinking of one bird that we have. Her name's Nellie, and she saw her entire flock murdered by, or killed by. I shouldn't say murdered, because this is an animal that was looking for food. It was a fox that came in, and she was injured in the attack. The people that had them didn't have a predator-proof environment and didn't see it as necessary, and asked us to take this sole survivor. And she was, it was heartbreaking to watch her noises. She had the exaggerated startle response. It took her probably 2 years before she finally settled into the flock. And you don't notice her because she's terrified. You notice her because she's Nellie. But we named her Nellie because we call her Nervous Nellie. But we've dropped the nervous because she's doing really well. But it did take about 2 years before she finally came around.
What do you think the source of quote unquote resilience is, or how would you define resilience?
The ability to overcome, unbelievable obstacles that have been placed in your path. For them, it's just overcoming the ignorance and sometimes intentional mistreatment that they've been exposed to. I think about my community, my sanctuary friends who rescue cows in particular. And I can think of one. I actually saw a young steer last night, and we went to pick something up for the sanctuary. We needed to purchase something from someone for the sanctuary, and I'd never been to their place. And they have a big farm, 285 acres, and they have cows. And I saw this young red Angus standing there, and I said, "Oh, can I go say hi?" And the guy probably thought I was crazy, but I went over and said hi to this little guy, and you could just see the fear. And he should be with his mom until he's 2 years old, and he's standing in mud up to his knees, and he has a halter on because they're trying to halter break him. Mm-hmm. And he's just standing there, and it's hanging in the mud, and he's scared, and he's alone in a muddy small pen, and that's where he lives. And it's heartbreaking. And you can see you want to get down? Okay. You can see it. I think you can really see it with the calves that are pulled from mom within hours or the first couple of days, so that they can use them for milk production. I think that's what you really see. It takes them a little bit of time to come around and connect with their families, their new families, when we rescue them.
How can humans then nurture and develop those seeds of resilience?
That's a question I'm not sure I can answer. What can we do to develop seeds of resilience? That as an adult, for me, my resilience came from my experience with animals, and I don't know if I can answer what is right for each person, but finding something that brings you joy and brings you happiness is probably the key. And for me, the animals bring me joy and bring me happiness, so that's where I focus my energy. And I think we're always in a state of trying to recover from our for those of us who've had adverse life experiences, and do need to count on our resilience to carry us through. Focus on the things that bring you joy. And again, these critters saved my life, and I want to give back to them by helping to save theirs and provide opportunities for others to spend time with them. They have such, especially the big animals, the cows, the horses, they have huge energy fields, and just spending time with them just makes you feel better. So maybe that doesn't work for everyone, but I say spend time with animals, and that will help you.
A number of people, I'll just sort of ask you sort of one of these questions. A number of people in the quote unquote animal rights movement say, oh, it's a failure. We're not making any gains and things like that. What's your opinion about that?
I think we're making huge gains. I would absolutely disagree. Just look at the plant-based foods that are coming out there. There's a demand for them because we are asking for it. And, we can look at, I struggle with, so let's talk about, if you don't mind, we'll talk about like KFC. It is a giant corporation and it contributes to the slaughter of millions and millions of baby chickens every single day. Extreme violence is built into their business model. However, they're offering a plant-based option. Now we can be cynical and say, yes, it's because it's going to make money for them. And that is absolutely true. And they're going to take that money that they make from their plant-based and they're going to continue to torture and kill chickens. And as an activist, I'm not going to eat at KFC. I just, as an animal advocate, I won't eat there. However, it's available for someone to try something different. This isn't, when I see activists getting upset over, there was a big controversy recently about KFC among animal activists, like we have no business eating there. I'm not here to police whether or not this is vegan enough for, or not, but it is an opportunity for people who aren't vegan or vegetarian to try an alternative. And we're seeing those alternatives show up everywhere. And that's exciting. And that is a huge, huge shift from when I went vegan 16 years ago. And even before that, over 20, I don't even want to think how old I am, 30 years ago when I stopped eating animals, and took them off my plate. We didn't have a lot of options. We have tons. From a Jewish perspective, if you look at Israel, it has the largest number of vegans per capita in the world. We're seeing shifts, not just here in the United States, but worldwide, where people are making more compassionate choices for their diet. So to say we're not succeeding, I think is, disingenuous and, looking at the glass half empty instead of really looking at reality. We're seeing some differences.
I agree with you. I think it's phenomenal. I've never really understood that criticism.
Yeah, I really don't think it has for me personally, I'm not going to eat a KFC. I don't want to eat plant-based nuggets that have been cooked in something that an animal has been cooked in. It's just, that's not for me. But if somebody else chooses to do that, okay, that's fine for them. One of the things that's super exciting in the animal movement is we're seeing an explosion of, well, it's exciting and it's disheartening sometimes too, but we're seeing an explosion of sanctuaries showing up all over the country, particularly the micro sanctuary movement. And, Gay, I would say you definitely fall into that category. You have your own micro sanctuary right at your place. And there's people that are taking in chickens, and there's chickens or maybe a goat or two, and they're providing exceptional care. There's grants available for these, or, for people who want to do micro sanctuary work. And that's super exciting to see more and more people taking an interest. And it provides, micro sanctuaries are going to have a greater reach because, their communities, a lot of times they might be in a suburban environment or even an urban environment where people are taking in house chickens. And it's an opportunity to educate your friends and neighbors and family members about the beauty that these farmed animals can bring into your life. And it, again, demystifies what they are. Meeting Curly Joe is she goes everywhere with me, and people want to meet her and talk. And they're like, I've never touched a chicken before. I've never seen a chicken before. She likes to be held. I'll let them hold her. If she seems like she's interested in connecting, I let them hold her. And that's the opportunities that we need to create, either through sanctuaries or micro sanctuaries, to get people to make a connection. Because once you make the connection to this, it's really hard to then sit down and have a meal that has her on their plate.
Well, I think another really important element is how it fosters a different human-human relationship. In other words, that there are communities, like you were talking about, people gather, sort of the famous things are at the, Thanksgiving, where people gather together with animals, and celebrate together. And then what you're talking about with the different kinds of, with Shabbat, where humans are starting to relate to each other through the medium of relationships with animals.
Well, and mealtime is such a powerful, cultural ritual that we all engage in. And if we can create a ritual that doesn't involve, that it doesn't involve causing harm to another being, I think that, that's an opportunity for change. So using mealtime, which is, we know that, food preferences and are formed in childhood based on our exposure. And if we can expose people to something different, most people don't have the opportunity to, they weren't given the opportunity. I grew up in a meat and potatoes family. I mean, that's what most of us weren't fortunate enough to be born into a vegan home. And I think going back to the KFC thing and the controversy, that controversy exists because those of us in the animal rights movement sometimes forget that we weren't born vegan. We came to this and it was a process for many of us. It didn't just happen overnight. And again, the key is be kind to the human animal as well as the non-human animal. And I think sometimes we forget that when we're so focused on their well-being, we forget to think about the human aspect as well, because it's equally as important, because without focusing on the human animal, we're not going to be able to create the change that we want to see.
Well, thank you so much. I'm monopolizing you, and I'm going to turn this over to Liz to open it up for questions, but you made me feel better by saying we were micro. I don't feel very micro with 60 animals, but anyways, but I feel a little bit more contained now that you said that.
I'm glad it helped.
Well, thank you so much. That's lots of food for thought, pun intended. And so we are going to open it up to questions from the audience. But real quick, just going to do a quick shameless plug. If you are available next month, we will be meeting with Dina Metzger, and she'll be joining us on March 13th, which is actually the second Sunday of the month. So slightly different than our usual first Sunday, but just going to get that shameless plug out of the way. And so, yeah, folks have questions, feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, or again, if you're uncomfortable, then you can go ahead and write in the chat box, and I'll go ahead and read those aloud for you. And I'm assuming maybe Curly Joe may be able to answer a few as well. So.
I can't see how to raise a hand, but I was wondering if I may start real quickly,
Yes.
because I have an appointment I have to get to. I am so incredibly grateful for you, Hadassah. We spoke on the phone yesterday, and I said I didn't understand why I was calling you. I understand now why, and I want you, it's the first time I've ever been able to mention this publicly, but I was trafficked as a newborn infant, just hours after I was born. And I understand intimately otherism, indifference, and abandonment, because it's been the strongest thread throughout my entire life. It's just like this spiritual portal. And my resiliency came with becoming, at a very young age, a Franciscan Catholic. I'm a follower of St. Francis of Assisi and working to become part of the Third Order on that. So I embrace everything you're saying. And through that resiliency, I was guided to become a director of Oregon Cougar Action Team and got a couple of master's degrees. And I was so grateful for the amount of time that Gabe Bradshaw was able to spend with me on that. All of it fantastic and seeds of hope and thought. But one of the things that I enjoy doing is studying the Jewish Bible and the English Christian Bible as to finding relevancy in those documents that so shape our lives as to why it's important to coexist with animals. And I want your thoughts on a verse I found in Ecclesiastes, and there are many, by the way, that I've found, but this one is the only one I'm going to talk about right now. Ecclesiastes 3:18. I also thought, as for man, God tests them so that they may see that they are like the animals. Man's fate is that of the animals, and the same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Man has no advantage over the animal. But I might add to that I believe animals are born with complete souls. I think the only species on earth fighting for their soul are humans. What do you see? Correct me if I'm wrong. Show me your insights. I'd welcome that.
Well, it's interesting. Of course, I believe that animals, we all suffer from speciesism to some degree. And I fight against it just like anyone. It's a lot of people have a harder time connecting to a chicken because they're so much different than us, than maybe a mammal, where you can have, there's some connection, some relation. So do I believe that, of course we live the same, we die the same, we suffer, we experience that. And, there is evidence, if you, from a religious perspective, which I don't know where I fall or believe anymore, but the vegan Eden theory, which, is that the Garden of Eden was vegan and animals were not permitted to be consumed until after the time of Noah, so after the flood. So there is a thread in, I can only speak from a Jewish perspective, there is a thread through Judaism that veganism was the way of being, and maybe we'll go back to that again, but I can't speak to it from a Christian perspective because that isn't my, that just isn't my background. But I agree with you. They experience life and death just like we do. And do I believe that animals have souls and that that ensoulment begins when they come into this world? Absolutely, I believe that they do. But even if I didn't, it doesn't matter. It matters that they have a right to be here and to experience life in a pain-free, compassionate way. So, yeah.
Well, I believe that becoming vegan is part of fighting for our soul. Now, I've been vegetarian for 30 years, vegan for the last 16. But Thank you so kindly for your time.
Thank you for sharing your story. It's very brave.
May God bless you big. Yes. And I told you yesterday, I said, I don't understand why I'm calling you. This is the first time I've ever made the announcement to anyone that I was trafficked.
I feel honored. Thank you.
I felt safe in your message. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you, Allison. It is an honor that you would, entrust all of us here. I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think it really helps other people who may not feel as confident and have had similar experiences. So I do have a question here in the chat, which is there's a request if you could please discuss kosher and other ritual slaughter and how we can stop it.
Oh, if I could figure that out, it would be done. But kosher slaughter, the difference between kosher slaughter and traditional, or I guess, non-kosher slaughter would be the better way, is that the animal isn't stunned. So that would be one thing that is different. And, this is uncomfortable. I'll talk about it dispassionately. Don't think that doesn't mean I have feelings about it. An animal that's killed by a shochet is the person that's been trained in ritual slaughter, and they have an incredibly sharp knife, and it's supposed to be a one slice, one cut, and the animal is supposed to be allowed to hang and bleed out. And they are very aware of this as it's happening, and it's horrible. And if you've seen any of the undercover footage on kosher slaughter or halal slaughter, it's horrific. How do we stop it? I don't know. I'm trying by educating people in my own way and my own postage stamp here in Southern Oregon. I'm trying to educate people about the beauty that animals bring into this world, and that they're sentient beings and that they deserve to not suffer or die to be a meal on our plate. And I think that's all we can do, is do our part, and live authentically and in integrity and do the right thing as far as what we choose to consume. And again, to be compassionate to people who aren't in the same place as we are. But to actually take on the agricultural, complex, that feels too big to me. So I do what I can here on my little postage stamp. And I hope that answers your question. It may not be what it might not be as, I don't have a roadmap on how to stop this. There's fabulous activists out there that, chain themselves to buildings and do that, but they're also putting themselves at risk for being labeled as a terrorist and spending the rest of their lives in prison. So when I was younger, I did those things, but the laws have changed. So I don't know if that is the way we should go. I have such mixed feelings on how we should address, dealing with with the slaughter that's happening day in and day out. So I do it the way that feels authentic to me, and that's by saving animals, finding homes, and living my life as in much integrity as I possibly can.
Thank you. And for the reminder, we can be the change we want to see in the world in our own ways and in our own postage stamps, as it were. So did anyone else have another question for Hadassah or Curly Joe?
I'll make a quick follow-up comment on that. I think that's part of the journey is self-reflection and self-inquiry and understanding what resonates with one's self individually. So chaining yourself up, doing undercover work, these more overt types of, I don't know what you want to call them, I think are very person specific. And I think it's really important in terms of, and Hadassah, you really have touched on this, is it's very important because then when we're in alignment with our philosophy and our ontology, then we, and our soul, you can call it that, we are less apt to perpetuate violence and bring aggression into the world. Even when there are things like, undercover, or like I said, chaining yourself or doing sort of, overt protests, they can, in alignment, they do bring in that kind of change and they do bring in that kind of peace. I think the difficulty is when, these are not easy, even for the individuals who are really aligned with that. But I do think that's really critical. Is to embrace that and to spend some time and appreciating oneself, exploring and appreciating oneself in terms of your capacity, what keeps you centered, learning practices to sort of recenter. It's really hard to take the reality in when you've been taught another kind of reality. So I think that, I don't know, Hadassah, if you want to comment on that just kind of some thoughts.
I think that we need to do what works for us, and it's going to be different from one person to the next. Absolutely. What works for me doesn't work for someone else. What worked for me 20 years ago doesn't work now. So it's honestly, it's such an individual path, and being willing to respect each other's path. Some people here may not be fans of PETA, for example, because of some of the controversial stories that are around them. But PETA is one of the reasons that I'm on this path. I got exposed to PETA literature when I was probably 9 or 10 years old, and I saved one of their little magazines that they had, and I saved that probably until I was into my mid to late 20s. It would fall apart now because I'm so old, but I had saved it forever, and because it was the thing that I just couldn't get out of my head. And that in your face kind of activism, is not effective for some, but it's super effective for others. So find your path, find what resonates with you. And if it's the in your face, we need all flavors within the animal rights movement. We need people that are going to be in your face and they're going to show you the graphic images. And then we need people that are going to, maybe take a softer approach. We're all doing the work, I think, is what I'm trying to say. And whatever resonates with you is what you should do, if there are any shoulds.
What a beautiful reminder to be kind to ourselves as well as, as we are animals also. So we do have a couple in the chat. The first is, do you have a prayer in English that we can say for the animals?
Oh, no, I don't. I'm sorry. I would love to say and be able to come up with something beautiful on the fly, but I don't. And I'm sorry. And that's just, you caught me off guard with that one. I would love to give it some thought, and I'd be happy to share it. And if you have a place that you can put something up, but I don't have something that I would be able to share with you on that, and I'm sorry.
I can give some insight to that, maybe.
I would be open to anyone giving insight to that. Fabulous.
One of the best prayers you can ever do is simply sing what you believe. Sing what you believe. Sing your desires. Sing your vision for the animals and human existence together, compatible and lovingly coexistence. Just sing it. You're out on a walk in the woods, just sing it. And to whatever presence you believe is God, sing it to that presence. And you've done a good song and a good prayer. David always sang. And I noticed that those who were prophets and those in our religious faith sang. And religion has a lot of elements that don't look really good or haven't worked out quite well. But the bottom line is there is an essence that made this created this earth and taught us what love is for all life. And in the beginning, that's what we had, was a love for all life. And so just make your song filled with love for all life, and it will be genuine and purposeful.
What a beautiful suggestion. And of course, song is what we have in common with birds and whales and so many other species. So I think that's
It was absolutely beautiful.
great.
You know, it made me think, Allison, that made me think of, there is a prayer that I often say when we have an animal who passes, our farm family comes together when we do a burial, or and we sing them off. And one of the song is called, it's not in English. That's the problem. You're asking me for something in English. I'm thinking of something in Hebrew, and it's Oseh Shalom, and it's Oseh Shalom b'mermav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al Yisrael v'amru amen. And in English it means he who makes peace in the high places in the heavens, let him make peace on us and upon all of the world, and say amen. So, you know, that's not necessarily animal specific, you know, when we're talking about animal specific, but I think we don't need to make it animal specific. A prayer for any being, if we stop separating animal and the non-human animal and the human animal, and just all beings, and can approach it from that perspective. But that is a Hebrew prayer that we say whenever we say goodbye. And it's part of our Kaddish, the prayer for the dead. It's a piece of the Kaddish that we say when an animal passes, but it's a beautiful prayer at any time.
It's gorgeous. One last thing quickly, the Our Father in the Christian element. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who've trespassed against us. Lead us not into temptation, and deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. That in my heart is for all life. And that goes right back again. We are a species like all other species. And we have to set aside this dominion idea that the Euro-Western culture has developed, and realize that dominion in the hands of God is glorious, but dominion in the hands of man is very troubled. And that is a prayer that deals with that and gets our mindset back on track.
Thank you, Allison. That was lovely. And I'm assuming off the top of your head, which is very impressive. So the next question that we do have in the chat says, I was born into the Jewish religion. The last few years, I have learned and practiced Buddhism. One thing that drew me to it is that it includes nature and animals. That fits into how I see nature and other beings. What do you think or know about that?
It's actually a common phenomenon in our tribe, and we have a term for it. It's called Jubus. And so it resonates. Being a Buddhist doesn't mean that you're not Jewish. I mean, Buddhism is a philosophy, not necessarily, a culture or religious path. So I think it's beautiful, and I think that they have a symbiotic relationship, and I think that the reason that we have coined that term Jubu is because it resonates with so many of us, and we connect with it. And I'm glad that you found something that resonates with you. And I would encourage you, if your Judaism still matters to you, find a way to incorporate the two, because together I think they're super powerful and quite beautiful.
Thank you. And you do have a thanks in the chat as well. And I have never heard that term before. So I love that. That's amazing.
I like it too. It's really fun.
I don't see any new things in the chat. So I have a question for you, because a lot of our work, especially with, birds, has a lot of overlap. And in doing my dissertation on poultry, as well as parrots, but mainly the poultry piece, I did draw this comparison between the Holocaust and other, sort of mass killings of human beings and what we're doing.
Did you do that in your dissertation?
Yes.
I can't wait to read it. I am so excited. Anyway, I just wanted to make sure I understood what you were saying.
Yes, and inspired greatly by, Karen Davis, who we mentioned earlier, and who was actually a guest on Living One about a year and a half ago. So if you haven't had a chance to watch any past recordings, that's a great one. I definitely recommend.
I did watch it. She's one of my heroes. I love her.
Me too. She's amazing. And I did receive, pushback on that. And I think that the main criticism that I got was that, sort of the idea was that by comparing these atrocities, right, that somehow it was diminishing the experience of the humans in the Holocaust, and that somehow, because to me, it was really almost like heartbreaking to hear that feedback, because to me there is no sort of zero-sum game when it comes to pain and suffering and atrocity. One does not negate the other. Like, yes, and I hurt and I witness hurting in another. So I was just curious sort of what your thoughts are on that, and if that seems to be the main criticism sort of that you've encountered as well, that somehow the comparing them diminishes the human suffering.
That is one of the main criticisms. One of the things in graduate school, we would talk about genocides and we would compare genocides. One of the things that we ended up discussing was that comparing suffering is useless. Suffering is suffering, and it doesn't matter, and you can't do it based on body count. You can't do it based on, well, that atrocity was much worse than this atrocity. Atrocities are atrocities, and suffering is suffering, and comparing them and saying one is worse than the other is pointless. But to make comparisons and say this happened and this happens, this is where speciesism comes in my opinion. And I am really careful about, I'm sure eventually I'm going to end up writing a book about, about this. This is a place I want to spend some energy.
You do.
I care so greatly about it, but we have to be so incredibly careful. And I think one of the things that, I know I bristle against when a friend of mine who's an animal activist was making Holocaust comparisons and posting about it publicly on Facebook. And I interacted with her in a private message about this, and she's not Jewish. And she was using specifically that genocide. And from my perspective as a Jewish person, non-Jews use our story to further a message, because I don't feel that maybe it will be handled with the sensitivity and delicacy that I think that it needs to be. And I'm being really careful about how I approach this, because I don't think that doesn't mean that it isn't valid, but it needs to be handled very carefully. So that is always it makes me bristle when someone who's not Jewish, in a sense of like appropriation kind of thing. You're using our story to further a message. That said, speciesism is the reason that people feel that it diminishes the experience of the people who were murdered in the Holocaust or any other genocide. Somehow you're diminishing that. And I don't see how another being suffering and loss of life, we're allowed to discuss the difference between the Hutus and the Tutsis and the Nazis, and we can look at the Armenian genocides and we can make those comparisons. But the minute you bring in factory farming and the comparisons that are so obvious, it is it's a big red button issue and people get very tense about it. And I think it's just really, how do we do it with sensitivity? How do we do it in a way? Because you don't want to lose the message because of the what you're using. Just because you're right doesn't mean you should. But I have a lot of feelings about this. I haven't sorted them all out. It's something that's on my mind regularly. And I'm glad that you did it. And I'm sure just the little interaction that I've had with you, I'm sure you did it in a very sensitive way. And I'm even more excited about reading your dissertation now. But I do think that those are valid comparisons. And I think we need to make them we need to be really mindful and recognize if somebody is uncomfortable with it and they get angry at it, it maybe take a step back, because you don't want to lose the message in being right.
I'll make a comment. I was somewhat involved with Liz's correspondence with this particular critique. And I just want to really underscore that Liz responded to this individual in an absolute stunning way, with so much clarity and so much integrity. And I think it was great. That being said, I purposefully use the word genocide. It's not considered very popular among biologists, conservationists, for example, with this wolf thing that I've gotten involved with. I'm not really, it's just, it's one of these, like, you get too close to the vortex, and I got pulled in a little bit. But, for me, and again, when I was doing my elephant work, I was very careful, because a lot of the work with the elephant PTSD, and Hadassah, I'm saying this on purpose to get your feedback, because a lot of the work were parallels with the Holocaust. A lot of the quote unquote data and information and concepts and ideas came from longitudinal studies on the experiences of individuals. And so there was one gentleman, unfortunately, he's passed. His name was Henry Crystal, and he was a survivor. And he was also became a psychiatrist. And the majority of his clients were survivors. And so anything that I did right, and I would talk to him, he was incredibly kind and patient, as most people always are. It always seems to me that I've always encountered very kind, patient people, I would run something by, because I would be drawing on these kinds of experiences. And I was talking about elephants, and also later it was chimpanzees. So I used him as, in a sense, and I actually wrote about it, which I might send you, Hadassah, because the whole experience of writing, it didn't have to be about the Jews or the what was happening in Rwanda. I did speak to a man there, Rwandan, or the elephants. It was really uncomfortable ground for me, in the sense of ethically, when you're making inference and talking about another's experience. So that has always remained, and that always will remain, something that I think is quite sacred to keep in mind. But I intentionally use genocide because in the circles that I do encounter in the scientific, for me, it's more of a political correct response. Like, for example, in Liz's case, Liz, you can correct me, I felt that individual was really responding not out of concern, but out of, I want to be politically correct. I don't want to get labeled or something. I don't want to cause waves. So in this wolf thing, for example, I'm very pointed about talking about genocide. And the other co-signer scientists, there's about 6 of them. I don't know why I'm included, because I'm really not in their quote unquote circle. But that term, they don't want to go near it. And I think it's a very important one. I mean, I guess that's kind of one of these examples of in your face, because from the perspective and definitions of genocide, and of course, when you get into that field, a whole thing goes on, because now it's become economic and political, which I found out. If some atrocity is called genocide, then there's all this social, political, and economic issues that get attached to it, because they're the United Nations in, and then there's a certain amount of reparation and all that kind of thing. So I'm just saying is that those are, to me, some of those interesting edges which go along with this whole legacy of speciesism. So I probably may offend some people, but in a sense, I do it on purpose, not to be offensive.
No, of course
but
not.
Also not in the sense of to fall back into political, correctness, muteness.
Well, I think using the word genocide is less loaded than using the word Holocaust with a capital H. And I think it's still in your face. It's still provocative, and provocative isn't bad. Provocative can be really good. I really do think the word Holocaust, which is often thrown around, is problematic, because that has a sacredness to it. People were persecuted specifically, and I think with long-term, deep-seated anti-Semitism that we see worldwide, it's just more of a trigger than using the word genocide. Doesn't make that any less provocative. And if you look up, Raphael Lemkin's, when he coined the term, and look at what he had to say about, what makes a genocide, that's a constant, it's an academic argument, ultimately, that we would have, when I remember in grad school, we would argue about, is it a mass murder or is it a genocide? Ultimately, it doesn't matter. Somebody was tortured and harmed and died as a result, but what makes something a genocide? And I think the work that you're doing right now around the wolf genocide, and I'll use it, is I think that's irrefutable. I don't think that there's any other way to look at it. They want them gone, and it's speciesist to not use that term. It's just a matter of, just being thoughtful when we do, and you're a thoughtful person. Some people, will throw it around and they don't think about what they're saying. Using, especially as our political climate has become more and more polarized, and you see people using Nazi terms and in calling people Nazis or using symbolism that is associated with the Third Reich. That's it's offensive and it's problematic, and I think that's where we see so much of this now. It brings up a lot for people who have family members or who survived these experiences. So it's all about being thoughtful, and doesn't mean don't use it. Just be mindful about how you do.
Yeah, thank you both. Yeah, it is tricky, and I think a good reminder that remain flexible and reflective. Because even if you put something out, if it's not necessarily well received, that may be feedback to sort of sit with it a little bit longer. I see Jody has had her hand up for a little bit. Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to say is that this is all this sort of fracturing that we encounter, but again, part of it has to do, or a large part of it has to do, is because the quote unquote animal experts are fields of pathology, zoology, and veterinarian, and so to use a human-based coined term, just like PTSD was. Yeah. It's jarring, and it hits that line, which really has nothing to do with past human things. It's more like the idea of associating with the human. So those are it's just another example, and in terms of just what you were talking about, there's all these different sort of walls that we're encountering. And so much of the work is really at the human-human interface. So I really appreciate you bringing all those nuances in.
Thank you for being willing to do the work, because it's challenging. Sometimes we have to be jarring for change to happen. I think challenging the status quo and helping people see their speciesism by using provocative terms can be incredibly useful.
Thank you, and my apologies for speaking over you. Okay. Jody, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm going to try this. My internet connection is a bit unstable. I just got a message telling me that. But firstly, I just really want to thank you so much, Hadassah, for this presentation. The reason, not only in itself, but rather because it is really germane to the work that I'm doing right now. I've been a critical animal studies scholar at the University of British Columbia in Canada and teaching these courses for about 12 years. And originally, quite frankly, it was really isolating and alienating, because this was not seen as having any kind of validity whatsoever. But I have to say that throughout that, what was sustaining to me was in fact the work done by the students who came through these courses and then started to ask questions and actually change their lives. But with regards to what we're talking about, I'm moved because Karen Davis is her work is on the course. I first became involved in writing about this because I had originally come across, and it was about 10 years ago, Gay Bradshaw's work. So thank you very much for that. It was about heart-centered science. And so consequently, I've been teaching this course with the main principle of ahimsa, that is to say, do no harm. And increasingly, I'm becoming aware of there are two paths to go with this. I'm becoming aware of the concern that students have about having an emotional response to what it is they're coming into knowledge of, because they sometimes feel, well, we're being trained to be critical and, to be intellectually rigorous, but what do I do when I feel this way? And my response is, especially when it comes to suffering, it isn't rocket science. We can certainly, identify it in a moment and in a heartbeat. So, but within this circle, if you will, comes the issue that we could say it's the debate that Marjorie Spiegel had brought forward, about, I guess, that book, The Dreaded Comparison, is at least a decade old. And in it, she has the foreword done by Alice Walker, who is not shy about making the comparison between slavery, the practice of slavery. And as you know, Alice Walker is an African-American writer who won the Pulitzer Prize for The Color Purple, but she's written a lot on making these comparisons. And so Marjorie Spiegel's The Dreaded Comparison is really key to this because, and now this work that I'm hearing and I'm finding actually quite sustaining being here on this call and with the center, but the fact of asking the question is what makes the comparison so dreaded in the first place? I mean, that, gets people having to articulate their resistance to it or else their acceptance of it. Why and how does such dread function? Because we know with, for example, the association between slaves and animals was a really familiar one. Slavery had applied the techniques of domination first developed in animal husbandry to humans of African descent. And so consequently, the deployment now, if you will, or the inclusion of thinking about genocide, I think is really critical. And in this course, and so thank you again for doing this presentation. I guess I'm not sure if I have a question. I may get there, but anyway, doing this course is trying to be inclusive of the voices that are not my voice. I'm a white Canadian scholar that are not my voice, but like Alice Walker's voice, Marjorie Spiegel's voice, voices by people like Claire Jean Kim, who has got an incredible essay that people might be interested in called Moral Extensionism or Racist Exploitation, the Use of Holocaust and Slavery Analogies in the Animal Liberation Movement. And I can send that to you, Liz, if you want to include that in your dissertation. But anyway, her point is...
Can you write that down? Because I don't have anything to write that down and I want to read that. So
okay, I'll put it in the chat. Because I just have, yeah, just one more thing to say about that. Her really fantastic analysis is that whilst there might be a political failure that PETA's whatever you want to call it, PETA's installation, there might not be a moral failure. So she's making this really interesting distinction to show how politically, when one has we could say the unique thesis applied to an event that has happened, like a terribly traumatic and destructive event, that how it's used then becomes a matter of politics, but at the moral level, a moral and ethical level, we have to be much more sensitive and consider how, in fact, the fact of the dread comes as a dilemma. It comes as an interventionist's dilemma, and it's something to be negotiated and dealt with, which again is why I try to put these other voices into this course. I even think one of my students is on this call, so that's great. But anyway, thank you so much for this. And I'll just pop that title here in the chat box.
Thank you. I really appreciate that you're including, when we start taking stories from marginalized people and using them to promote our agenda, even if it's a worthy one, it can be problematic. And I appreciate that you're finding people that are, that fit a specific, group and use their literature to help educate people. And I love that your students are having emotional responses. When we get into the world of academia and research, we kind of we forget that we are, that we're human. Sometimes we just become these machines that are consuming data and trying to make sense of it. And there's an emotional piece that's undeniable. And I'm happy to hear that your students are having a reaction to that. And one thing that one of my partners has taught me about this work is that perfection is the enemy of good, not being vegan enough and not doing it right, choosing the wrong word, saying, using, like when we're talking about using genocide or Holocaust to describe what's going on. Yes, this isn't perfect, but if we don't need to strive for perfection, we need to strive for good. And if your intentions are pure and you're trying to come at this from a compassionate place, I really think that will shine through.
Well, just this last week, one of the students said that he had a real emotional response to this story by Alice Walker, Am I Blue? And he said, and then I felt ashamed I had this response. And I said, that's really interesting. So we ended up having this very long conversation of why within the university you would be ashamed of having this kind of a response. So that, this is why I'm super appreciative of the work that's being done here, because it actually makes me feel like I'm just not alone.
And this is this work that we do, those of us that are working in animal rights, and I can say as running a sanctuary, this is a lonely job. And it's very isolating. Those of us who are trying to be the voice for voice for the voiceless, voice for these animals. It's lonely and isolating at times, and it feels really good to be in a community of people right now. To be in a community of people that an intellectual community that is open to having this dialogue.
Great, thank you,
Jody, and everyone. I'm going to use the same words that Liz used. Shameless plugging, but Liz and I have mutual shameless plugging in this. You might want to look into, if you haven't, Jody, in terms of your courses, the concept of accompaniment, and a book by Mary Watkins, Watkins. It's a Yale University Press, called Mutual Accompaniment. I don't know the subtitle, but accompaniment is this idea which has been practiced, quote unquote, in everywhere. But it's this notion of it's one of these things that's hard to describe. In other words, it's really a medium of acknowledging, quote unquote, differences, whatever the source of them might be, but as partners, and recognizing whether it's race, gender, whatever it is, economic, whatever, but not focusing on that, really focusing on being in relationship in such a way which is supportive for that individual and their agency. So it's really a kind of an antidote for dualism and comparison and differencing, and in such a way where it really kind of goes under, it goes under the superficial, which are not superficial at one level, because they really are the experiences of an individual, which is very serious. And yet it provides a way of participating and being and listening and supporting in a mutual way. And Mary makes a real strong point of underscoring mutual, which really contrasts it from a do-gooder or whatever you want to call it, that kind of differencing in that way. So accompaniment is a beautiful.
That's great. I really like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And to piggyback on more shameless plugging, I am seeing also some words in the chat about it is kind of lonely and isolating sometimes, and it can feel it can feel very lonely sometimes in this work. And we do have, I know a lot of people are not, totally into social media, myself included, it's hit and miss, but we do have a Facebook group that is called the Carullos Constellation. And that's where, this basically community that's here in this room, as well as others who are interested in this work. It's a safe space where we're all there to mutually support each other, whether it's just, through articles or even just sharing grief and stuff. And it is a closed group, so you will have to apply. But I'll go ahead and I'll put the address in the chat box as well. And we would love to see any or all of you there. And the more voices, the better, and the more support, the better. So we would love to have you.
Thank you so much, neighbor.
Yes.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
Unfortunately, it was so wonderful that we're going to have you come again. So
thank you. It was super nourishing. Thank you for the opportunity.
You both did yourselves in by being so wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for joining us. And it's been lovely to see you all. I have not had a chance to type it in the chat box, but it's called the Carullos Constellation, Kerullos, and then Constellation with a C. So just type it in your little search bar in Facebook, and you can go ahead and find us that way. Thank you so much, Hadassah. Thank you to Curly Joe. I'm not sure if, oh, yep, there she is. Yep, thank her. And thank you all for sharing your weekend with us. We know that time is precious, so we really do appreciate you spending some of it with us. So thank you all so much. We hope to see you next time as well.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.